After the invasion by Russia, in 1881, there was born in the town of Thessaloniki, which is now in Greece. There was born of a Turk named Ali Riza and of Zubida, his wife, a boy whom they named Mustafa. So Ali Riza was a timber dealer and a former government employee, and Zubida came from a long-established family of Albanian stock. Now, Ali Riza died when Mustafa was 7 years old. So Mustafa grew up in fairly modest circumstances and had 5 siblings, only one of which survived childhood. It was a sister. After the death of the father, the family moved to the countryside to live with one of Mustafa's uncles. And Mustafa did not attend school regularly until he moved back to Thessaloniki at the age of nearly 10. And he wasn't there for long. He dropped out of school again. But at the age of around 15, he applied to a middle school, was accepted and graduated in 1895 as one of the top students. This is where his mathematics teacher gave him the surname Kamal in praise of his skills. Kamal means perfection in Arabic. In 1889, the first Armenian massacres took place in Turkey, followed by others in 1894, 1896, 1915 and 1920, which ended in the complete disappearance of the Armenians from Turkey. After graduation, Mustafa attended cadet school in Macedonia. In 1899, he moved to Constantinople, capital of the empire, and became an officer in the military academy over there. In 1908, as an army chief of staff, he supported the Young Turk Rebellion, which deposed the Sultan and restored a constitutional government. In 1911 and 1912, he fought as a major in the Italian-Turkish War. In 1912, Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria formed an alliance and attacked the Ottoman Empire. This was the first Balkan War, and Mustafa Kemal fought in it as well. In 1914, Turkey took its obsolescent army into the First World War as an ally of Germany. In February 1915, a large British naval fleet comprising battleships, destroyers, and transport ships entered the Strait of the Dardanelles. Their plan, conceived by Winston Churchill, was to enter the narrow strait, smash the Ottoman defensive forces using the enormous firepower of their battleships, land a large occupation force of about 80,000 soldiers, and take Constantinople. At this time, Mustafa Kemal was an unknown officer. He commanded a feeble, ill-equipped, and outmatched Turkish division at the Gallipoli Peninsula. Yet his brilliant strategy and ferocious personal leadership changed the course of the battle and the war. Day after day, week after week, month after month, his forces beat back the British, Indian, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops time after time and fought them to a vicious and brutal stalemate. After 10 months, the British signaled defeat and sailed back, leaving behind a new hero in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal gained worldwide acclaim and prestige for his role in saving Turkey. But yet, just one victory and one great general was not enough for Turkey. The World War was lost, and the end of this war in 1918 brought with it the end of the old Ottoman Empire. In one of the suburbs of Paris, Sèvres, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. Its largest chunks were handed over to the British and the French. Other valuable possessions were assigned to the Italians and the Greeks. Constantinople and the Straits were internationalized. Constantinople was occupied by British and French troops. And the parts of the former Ottoman Empire inhabited by Arabs were placed under great power tutelage. Other former Turkish possessions like Armenia and Kurdistan were to gain independence. Under the Treaty of Sèvres, the Turks were cut off not only from the Straits but also from the Mediterranean Sea. All they were given was a small region in the highlands of Anatolia. The Caliph, eager to retain his power, his title, and his privileges, extended his full cooperation to the British, to the occupiers. He ordered the Turkish army to stamp out all opposition to the foreign occupation. He drew upon his authority as the leader of the Islamic world and called upon his subjects to stand by the Caliph and the throne. Priests throughout Turkey repeated his message and exhorted the people to support the Caliph. So many towns and villages rose up in support of the Caliph, and others rose up against the occupation. So what happened was that town was divided against town, family against family, father against son, brother against brother, and from end to end, Turkey was torn in the hideous nightmare of civil war. Meanwhile, Greece prepared for a new invasion of Turkey, confident that the Allied armies would not prevent it from doing so. And on May 5th, 1919, the Greeks landed their troops on the shores of Anatolia. At this time, when this happened, Mustafa Kemal was in the town of Ankara in Anatolia. He organized a Turkish liberation movement and raised a free Turkish army. His goal was to create a modern Turkish republic exclusively for the Turkish people. And he was constantly in danger of being captured and executed by the Caliph's forces. Mustafa Kemal quickly gathered the troops of an occupied Turkey and went to war with Greece. The war with the Greeks lasted 3 years, from 1919 to 1922. This was a war of extermination, atrocious, and no mercy was asked or given. In September 1922, the Greeks were driven back to the Aegean Sea. Thousands of Greeks poured into the town of Smyrna on the western shore of Anatolia. They were fleeing from Mustafa Kemal's armies. So offshore Allied ships stood by and watched while Mustafa Kemal's forces entered the city. And then they took vengeance. Brutal massacres were committed, unspeakable atrocities were committed. And then the city was burned. The final atrocity of the Great War. The final atrocity that ended the war. The outcome of the Great Fire of Smyrna was the complete exodus of the Greek and Armenian population of the city to Greece. So that was the end of the war. After winning the war, Mustafa Kemal removed his uniform, never to wear it again. He was given the title of Ghazi, which means holy warrior, and he was granted dictatorial powers by the elected National Assembly. The foreign occupation forces were evacuated from Constantinople, and Caliph Mehmed VI, whose family had reigned over Turkey for 7 centuries, feared for his life and went into exile as crowds cheered his going. The war ended with a compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey based on religious identity. This resulted in a near complete expulsion of Christians from Turkey and a similar expulsion of Muslims from Greece. In 1914, non-Muslims made up more than 19% of Turkey's population. By 1927, they were only 2.5% of Turkey's population, and in 2005, this figure had dropped to just 0.2%. Ataturk's dream of a Turkish republic exclusively for the Turkish people came true. In 1924, the Ottoman Caliphate was abolished, So as the first president of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal kept his limitless wartime powers and his command of the army. He renamed Constantinople to Istanbul, and he made Ankara the capital of Turkey. He established Turkey as a truly secular republic. He abolished the use of the Arabic script in Turkey, and he adopted the Latin script instead. Instead of Friday, which is the day sacred to Islam, he proclaimed the Western Sunday as the official day of rest. He banned the burqa and the hijab. He abolished polygamy. He gave women equal rights under the law and opened all trades and professions to women. He ordered Turkey's citizens, men as well as women, to adopt Western clothes and Western-style family names. He himself accepted the title of Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. Ataturk adopted 6 young orphan girls. One of his adoptive daughters went on to become the world's first female fighter pilot. In 1938, Ataturk died at the age of 58. He spent 13 years of his life in active warfare fighting for Turkey. After that, for 15 years till his death, he was Turkey's first president and absolute ruler. Ataturk's legacy is that he single-handedly first saved and then transformed the country by the sheer force of his will. He forced Turkey to modernize. He forced the people to give up Islamic culture and the Islamic way of life. He single-handedly built, out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, a modern, secular, powerful, and prosperous Turkey, a Turkey for the Turks. So now our story moves eastwards to India. In 1915, after about 21 years in South Africa, Mohandas Gandhi sailed to India. And upon arriving, he joined the Indian National Congress. He quickly became an enormously influential, powerful, and popular leader. Now, in 1919, as we saw, the Ottoman Caliph's position was greatly weakened and made ineffectual by Mustafa Kemal's Turkish liberation movement. This raised the very real possibility that the caliphate could be abolished. Now, these events were happening in a far-off country, 2,000 kilometers away from India. They had nothing to do with India or with India's freedom movement. No one in India even knew about these things, except for India's British-educated, English-speaking elite. So in 1919, several of these British-educated Indian Muslim leaders formed the All India Khilafat Committee and launched what came to be known as the Khilafat movement. They included people such as Muhammad Ali Jauhar, his brother Shaukat Ali, Abul Kalam Azad, and Mukhtar Ahmed Ansari, who happens to be former Vice President Hamid Ansari's granduncle. They aimed to build political unity among Indian Muslims and use that influence to protect the caliphate. They also founded the Jamia Millia Islamia in 1920 to promote independent education and unity for Indian Muslims. Now, Mohandas Gandhi strongly and wholeheartedly supported the Khilafat movement. He grew personally close to the Khilafat leaders. He exhorted the people of India, to support the Khilafat movement. Now, a question: how many of you have Twitter accounts? Please raise your hands. So, quite a few. Right. So, the average Twitter user, I would say, would have about a couple of hundred followers, approximately. Now, everybody who's on Twitter has strong opinions and passionate beliefs about various things, about politics especially. And they tweet their views and opinions passionately. The problem, though, for the average Twitter user is that they don't have much traction. Their views and opinions don't reach a big or a wider audience because only a handful of people follow them. Now, let's say that you have a Twitter account which has 100 followers, and you tweet all the time, but you don't get very much interaction. Now, what if an influencer of a big Twitter account with, say, 1 million followers were to follow you and start retweeting your tweets? So what would happen then? So in that case, what will happen is that you will get thousands of new followers overnight, and your followers will keep growing as this influencer keeps retweeting your tweets. The number of people interacting with you will grow exponentially. You will start connecting with an entire community of like-minded people, and more people will join that community. And pretty soon you will find that you no longer need the momentum of the retweets of that big influencer to influence others. So essentially what happens is that you become an influencer yourself, and your ideas, opinions, and your voice gains traction. It gains currency. Your opinions gain currency. Now imagine that Twitter existed in 1919 and everybody had Twitter accounts. Huh? So if that were true, then who would have the biggest Twitter account? Mahatma Gandhi. Because he was the most influential and popular leader of the time, not just India, but worldwide. So let's say he has 100 million followers. It's not too far-fetched. He was very popular and very influential. And these obscure and unknown Khilafat leaders, they would have just a handful of Twitter followers, right? 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. So that's not nearly enough to build any kind of traction. Now, what if Gandhi followed the Khilafat leader's Twitter account and began retweeting their tweets and opinions regularly, daily? So what will happen is that these Khilafat leaders would quickly become powerful influencers themselves. They would gain a big following themselves, and soon they would not need Gandhi's help anymore to build their following and pursue their political agenda. So this thought experiment illustrates the effect that Gandhi's championing of the Khilafat movement had in 1919 or 1920. It gave enormous publicity to this cause, to an obscure movement in support of a foreign cause, a movement that was irrelevant to India and indifferent to the cause of India's independence. Nobody in India knew about the movement or the cause. Gandhi gave it importance and brought it right into the national center stage. So Gandhi's championing of the Khilafat movement unified and brought together Indian Muslims from across the nation. It unified them in service of a foreign cause that had nothing to do with India's freedom movement. It unified them in allegiance to a foreign ruler, an Islamic system of governance, and Sharia law. It legitimized the idea that Indian Muslims owe allegiance elsewhere and have interests that do not align with India's. It planted the idea of otherhood, of separateness, that their interests and causes and their destinies were separate from those of India's non-Muslims. Gandhi's championing of the Khilafat movement also led to millions of Hindus and Sikhs and others participating in the movement. So the impression was that the word Khilafat has something to do with the Arabic word khilaf, which means opposition. It means dissent. That word, obviously, as we know, it's quite widely used in Hindi. And if I'm not mistaken, this false notion was also taught in India's history textbooks after independence, that Khilafat movement was a movement against the British, a movement to oppose the British. So what happened was that millions of Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists, Jains and others took part in the Khilafat movement.
The actual Arabic word is mukhalfa, but then this was popularized as opposition to.
I see. Okay, right. So what happened was that millions of Hindus and Sikhs and others, they took part in the Khilafat movement in the belief that it was about opposing the British, when in reality they were agitating in favor of restoring an Islamic system of governance and Sharia law. In 1922, the Khilafat movement's leaders criticized Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence and broke their ties with him. And after 1924, when Ataturk abolished the caliphate, interest in the movement faded away. But, however, the Khilafat movement had a powerful cascading effect on the Indian freedom struggle. It became the catalyst for the demand for an Islamic Pakistan separate from India. Its principal leaders, the Ali brothers, joined the Muslim League, and they went on to play a major role in the growth of the Muslim League's popular appeal and the subsequent Pakistan movement, which culminated in the partition of India. Now, curiously enough, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was highly critical of Gandhi's support to the Khilafat movement. He saw it as an endorsement of religious fanaticism. Jinnah was a member of the Indian National Congress since 1906. He was a member of the so-called moderate group in the Congress, which favored Hindu-Muslim unity in achieving self-government. Jinnah even opposed the formation of the All India Muslim League in 1906. At that time, he said that the principle of separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims was dividing the nation against itself. So these were the views of Jinnah. Now, Jinnah was a prominent Congress leader during the decade of the First World War. He led a Congress delegation to London in 1914. By 1920, Gandhi, whose methods and policies Jinnah strongly disagreed with, had taken over the Congress leadership, and Jinnah found himself marginalized. Disillusioned and frustrated, he resigned from the Congress that year. He spent much of the next 14 years in political wilderness, spending much of that time in England. In 1932, Jinnah read Ataturk's biography. This had a profound effect on Jinnah. He became obsessed with Ataturk. For a while, it was all that he talked about, even at home, even to his daughter Dina, who was about 13 years old at the time. Ataturk's life story gave Jinnah a new purpose in life. Jinnah returned to India in 1934 and set out to work for a separate homeland for India's Muslims, using Ataturk's career and actions as a template. So when the British eventually partitioned India, the compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey was replicated in a one-sided way in the form of Pakistan's expulsion and eradication of its Hindu and Sikh population. Events such as the Armenian Genocide and the burning of the city of Smyrna were replicated in the violence and terror that Jinnah unleashed during the so-called Direct Action Day, and also in the unspeakable violence and atrocities perpetrated during partition. Those tactics were seen again in the Kashmir Valley in 1989, in the genocide and occupation of the Kashmiri Pandits. And customs such as bride kidnapping that we spoke about earlier are still rampant in Pakistan, and they are used exclusively on young Hindu girls. Jinnah died in 1948. This is his mausoleum. This is Ataturk's mausoleum. So Jinnah was inspired by Ataturk in life and in his death. Now, let's be realistic. Jinnah was no Ataturk. Ataturk was an absolute colossus of a man. He was a truly great military commander and an equally great reformer of his country. Jinnah had no comparable qualities. Jinnah, however, was fortunate that his ambitions aligned perfectly well with the British plan to partition India. So the credit for India's partition does not go to Jinnah. It goes to the British and the Indians who helped them.